All right, we're hitting a quorum here, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Danya Madhusudan, and I support our diversity, equity, inclusion community here at Insight Partners on our portfolio experience team. Today, we're going to be exploring bias in AI, and this event is part of our larger Black History Month programming. So before we begin, I'm going to go over a little bit of housekeeping for us. This event is being recorded, and if you would like to share this recording with others after the event, we encourage you to do so. We will be sharing a webinar link to you by the end of the week, so you can share it out. It will also be posted on our website and Insight's Go community platform for those of you who are part of our portfolio. If you do have questions during the event, there is an open chat Q&A box that you can submit your questions in. I do want to note that we have sourced all of our discussion questions from the audience through the registration process. So we're really excited to be addressing what you'd like to learn from this session. And last thing for housekeeping, we'd love for you to share your feedback. We have a 30-second survey that's going to pop up on your screen at the end of this event. Please take a moment to let us know how it went, and we read all of your feedback to incorporate it into future events. So for those of you who are in our portfolio, we invite you to join our DE&I community by signing our CEO Scale Up Pledge. We have the opportunity for your company to sign your commitment to DE&I and gain access to a bespoke community of committed people leaders who are building their teams with a lens on equity and inclusion. And we send out monthly newsletters to keep you updated on our curated partner programming to help reduce barrier to action, monthly digital events like this one, and best practice guides that we create for you. So if you'd like to learn more, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to work with your team. And then for those of you who are joining us who may not yet be familiar with Insight Partners, we have been investing in software for over 25 years, and particularly relevant for this conversation, we're investors in AI. So we're now partnered with over 600 transformative portfolio companies, and we invest in software across all stages globally. And given this, we want to leverage this experience in investing in AI with our panelists today. So with that, I have the pleasure of welcoming our speakers today. We have George Mathew, Managing Director here at Insight Partners, who will be moderating this discussion, and Max Serebrikov, co-founder and CEO of Sanus AI, a company focused on building technology to revolutionize communication for multilingual speakers. Krishna Gade, founder and CEO of Fiddler AI, a pioneer in AI observability. And then Dr. Brianne Adams, assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University. At Georgetown, Brianne teaches courses on ethical approaches to technology with an emphasis on race, gender, sexuality, and ability. So with that, I would like to go ahead and hand it over to George.
Thank you so much, Danya. Really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation, particularly at the end of Black History Month. And as we kind of dive into this conversation with some of the leading experts here and really thinking about bias today, I want to just start the conversation just with the question of like, what is bias, right? And what are like the main types of bias that we really need to be thinking about, be wary of, particularly as we think through some of the opportunities and challenges in the world of AI. So I don't know if Brianne, you want to start, or Krishna, anyone is welcome to kick off that first question.
Sure. I'll try to think through that question alongside of you all today. So for me, thinking about bias in AI, it's really about considering the nuances, right, about what we mean by bias and the ways in which it can show up. It's not this very heavy-handed, overarching, all-encompassing aspect of it, because bias can be unconscious bias, and also it could be intentional bias as well. But these biases operate to really, for me, and how I break it down to my students, to say, who are we kind of not thinking of when we are entering into the conversation about design, reach, all of those things. And so it could be ability-wise, who are we not thinking of when we're designing something? And that's where bias can come into play if we're not considering different populations.
Max or Krishna, any
Yeah.
you want to add to
So
Brianne's?
I guess like my take is, bias exists in our society, right? It's present in the human condition, it comes from our evolutionary roots. Obviously we over the years, human race has taught itself to be more and more thoughtful and try to prevent these, cognitive biases that we have. But unfortunately, the data that we are collecting for AI systems is coming from the society, which is not a perfectly equitable society. And the function of the AI systems is to actually discriminate, because they classify, between a cat image and a dog image, a fraud application versus non-fraud application, or what's a good content versus bad content. So their notion is to be able to like classify and discriminate things. And when they actually look at these inherent biases in the data, they pick up on those things and naturally use those signals to sort of like classify, who's going to get a loan approved, who's not going to get loan approved, who's eligible for, this particular job application, who's not eligible, right? And so the goal for us, like from a AI community, is to, can we actually prevent the AI systems from amplifying the already existing bias? Like that is a big problem that I feel like, because like we already have bias in society, but if the AI systems can take it to another level and amplify it, because now they can run this on steroids, and that's actually going to be a big problem, because the outputs of the AI systems will probably govern the lives of so many people, and I think that to me is like the big hairy issue here.
Yeah,
Matt?
it's super interesting. I think it's interesting seeing one side of the equation, which is more of the cultural aspects of bias, and then the other side of the equation, which is more of the machine learning components, right? I think we're a lot more familiar with cultural bias that's more social, economic, in nature, and gender related as well. But there's also machine learning performance-based bias, which Krishna outlined. And with this, it kind of comes in two components, right? Components associated with data bias. And data bias revolves kind of around how you sample the data, how it gets fed into the algorithm, how you label the data as well. That's a very big component. And then the other side of performance bias is algorithmic bias, right? Which is the assumptions that you essentially make when building your algorithm. And you may have certain feature selection as part of the model that you create. There might be decisions around boundaries that Krishna outlined, right? Boundaries that classify certain data, and so on. So that's the way I would look at bias.
That's great. And so I think, Krishna, you had actually mentioned this, that bias is rooted in the human condition itself, right? And so I guess when we think through that statement, is it realistic at that point to put more onus on, the machines themselves being able to mitigate that bias in some way? And, do we really stand a chance, particularly with this sort of algorithmic exponentialization that happens, particularly around AI systems today, to really manage that human bias and potentially not let it get in the way of just better systems, better decision making?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I think, I think the current problem is probably not even mitigation. Can we actually reduce the amplification of it? Because like let's say there is let's take any job occupation, right? Like it's not a perfectly equitable society. You will have probably a lot more male CEOs than female CEOs. You may have a lot more male software engineers than female software engineers. So in the same way, like maybe more female nurses than male nurses and whatnot. So and with respect to races and whatnot, this discrepancy shows up. In fact, now there was a study recently done by CMU where they basically took all of these job descriptions and they actually tried to generate images based
Mhm.
on job description, and they classified in terms of like how these images were distributed across all of these text to image tools like DALL-E's, Midjourneys, Stable Diffusions, and they looked at the distribution of these images in with these various like gender groups and race groups, and you'd see consistently that the outputs of these generative models, the distribution was much more biased against the minorities or like the women groups than the underlying population itself,
Mhm.
than what actually is available on Google or in these underlying data sets, right? So the problem is that how do we actually mitigate the amplification of these biases? Because that to me is the biggest worry. But as you said, it's a very hard problem to completely do away with bias, right? Because there's so many correlations within the data. People are trying to apply synthetic data approaches to sort of publish like new synthetic data with maybe like for example, a query like inmates on this data set produced 80% of people with color, like essentially people who are likely to be imprisoned and whatnot, right? And so
Mhm.
so this is like, so how do we actually reduce these amplification to maybe produce synthetic data sets, and gets into a little bit of technical approaches on how do we prevent bias. But I think the goal for us to be like, can we actually at least make sure that the generative AI systems are not tilting the scale completely, away from us? I think, and that to me is like the biggest worry.
Yeah, and before we get into some of those technical solutions, I think there is some things that we can be thinking about as leaders within our respective organizations. And you mentioned a little bit about diversity in data, but I also just want to highlight maybe, Brian, you can start off this thread on what about the diversity in teams themselves that are responsible for bringing, data and systems together, and how do we think about diversity and talent for building these systems over time as well?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question, and to kind of go off of what Krishna was saying is that at this point, and I'm thinking about teaching my students about the history of how we've kind of come to this current moment,
Mhm.
and that there has been so much bias that has been kind of passed along unchecked, which is really exciting to meet Max and Krishna, because you all are trying to undo some of these things that have been embedded in these processes for so long. I think, though, to then bring it back fully to your question, is that three prongs really, is that technology is here to get us from A to B. That's how I kind of like break it down in its most component part to my students. And so because of that, we have the opportunity to make it be better to do, to help us get from point A to B. And the ways in which we go about that, in terms of diversity and inclusion and increasing different modes of understanding, is to say that everybody in this space is capable of learning and trying to approach these solutions differently, first of all. So that's not only those minoritized people literally physically in the room, but also those who are not a part of those identities and groups as well, right? And then two is the culture at the company, or the solution-oriented aspect, always considering these questions at every step of the process. And that might be human resources, that could be the actual design itself, that's the marketing of it, that's everything that goes into basically making a company function well. Are these questions a part of the culture, and do people also feel comfortable, right, in doing so? So it's not one thing to just have bodies in the seats, but is there a culture of support around, this is our mission, right? This is our goal, and we're not going to do this just from the tech, kind of like A to Z rather, of the design of something, but rather, how are we doing this across, right, the mission of our entire company? And I say that because all of my students are not African American studies students, right?
Mhm.
They're coming to my class from government, just the interdisciplinarity of it all. And so what I want them to do is take what they're learning in my class and be able to take it forth to their own careers. And I think that that has to be something that's consistent throughout these companies.
That's great. Any comments, Max or Krishna, on like diversity in the data that's going into the systems, the diversity in team members that are responsible for building the AI systems of the current day and in the future?
Yeah, from my end, I'd say there are a few important things to consider from a diversity lens, especially on the hiring front, right? So it's very critical, very important to source and pursue diverse talent for various roles, because essentially, if you're hiring a person to spearhead the analytics component of your machine learning algorithm, it's important for them to be diverse, to also consider the biases that might exist. And so I have a few suggestions in general that worked out for us at Sonus, and I've heard at other organizations as well. So I think it's important to work with executive and recruiting teams to think about how various biases might emerge, within organizations' hiring processes. If a company uses a recruiting firm, it's very important to stress components of gender and race in the recruiting process. A lot of companies recruit from college campuses as well. As part of that, it's also important to recruit from campuses with more diversity in their student bodies. Another good example is if, for example, you're interviewing women, it's important to include women in the interview process and hiring panels as well. Same thing applies to, components of, racial components and so on. So I think another important component is associated with diversity from an investor lens as well. Like, do you have on your board or the core decision makers in the organization? I think it's also useful to provide speaking opportunities for diverse members in your team. It's going to attract other candidates to your company that with similar background. One last thing I'd say is it's also important to think about benefits, right? So if, like, for example, you as an organization, you have maternity policies that supports, working women or working mothers, excuse me. So these are just a few things that are important. But I also want to emphasize a lot of startups do a lot of hiring from large incumbents, Google, Meta's of the world. And if you want to hire diverse employees, the pool that you hire from in big tech is narrow also from a diverse lens, from a diversity lens. Diversity also becomes a little bit difficult when thinking of it from like a downstream perspective for startups. So it's another separate component, but yeah.
Max, appreciate you just covering a lot of ground there in that last answer. If we shift a little bit over towards the solutions here, right? And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to hear a lot more from both yourself, Max, and Krishna is you've actually been genuinely working on some of the sort of technical and operational solutions that help mitigate bias, the things that we set up here in this conversation. So maybe in that regard, Krishna, why don't you start off and just kind of introduce a little bit more about even what Fiddler is doing and where you started the journey, and Max, if you can also do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are an AI observability startup. Our mission at Fiddler is to build trust into AI, and the approach that we have taken is that, we believe that like data could have inherent potential biases. Models could be trained upon. They can have inadvertent biases. But how do we check for these things? And so that's where Fiddler comes into picture. So Fiddler can instrument the model and process the data that you're supplying to the model, the outputs of the models as well, and constantly observes for things that could be potentially biased against different potential genders, races, or other sort of segments that you want to monitor for. And so by doing that, you could potentially prevent small issues from becoming very big, right? So you could catch these things ahead of time. So let's take a scenario where I'm building like a very classical machine learning application to set credit limits for my applicants. And so if and there were scenarios in the past where companies did not properly test for these models and where they have launched products where they discriminated against women by not actually providing equitable credit limit setting and all. These kinds of things can be detected in the design phase itself, where you can validate the model and run it against a bunch of test sets, look at like these different metrics. We provide some of the out of the box metrics around measuring disparate impact and equal opportunity, but also you could segment the data and see how the model is performing across whatever segments, gender-based segments, occupation-based segments, income segments, depending upon how you want to assess the problem, and see how the model is doing. And then also constantly monitor it in production. And so in doing that, we believe that you could actually get a handle of these things. It's and prevent failures from happening. And so I think the actual prevention of it comes back to like how you are designing the model. And this is not something, it's not in our purview, but we sort of advocate for this thing so that you're looking into the data and the training data, how you're collecting, what kind of sources you're collecting from. Are you looking at the distribution of that training data? And how do you, if there is not enough training data for certain, categories, how are you going to amplify the training data? You're going to go get synthetic data sets. How is it going to affect your model performance? So that's a little bit outside of the purview of the product that we offer, but we generally do advocate for how, best practices that you need to involve. And then some of the things that Max mentioned around multiple people around the table, create this whole responsible AI process within the company. So you can have multiple stakeholders. So there's checks and balances happening between the model creator and the model reviewer, and having teams to review these models. So these are some things that we sort of like advocate for.
And Max, maybe you want to highlight where you've been taking the journey at Sonus.
Yeah, so thank you. At Sonus, what we do is we build algorithms for speech understanding. And we currently largely sell to enterprise customer care centers and various BPOs as well. When building out Sonus, we were thinking, what are the components that exist in speech, misunderstandings, right? There are a lot of possible things that might happen. Say someone's communicating, there's background noise, different various, rates of speech that might appear, the quality of the signal itself. But in our eyes, the first algorithm that we built out around 3 years ago, was an algorithm that addresses one of the core components of bias in communication. And in our eyes, it's accent-based misunderstanding. So we built a conversion engine that allows people to choose whatever accent they want to have in communication. We also started building additional algorithms around background noise and speech enhancement algorithms that further improve clarity of communication. And our journey really starts around a very fascinating incident that happened while me and my co-founders were at Stanford. So we were studying artificial intelligence. We had a good friend of ours who was a Stanford systems engineer, who was an international student originally from Nicaragua. I don't know if folks are aware, but a few years back, there was a pretty big civil unrest that happened in Nicaragua that sadly left our friend, this guy named Raul, in pretty dire, uncomfortable financial situation. And he had to take a leave of absence and go back home to support his family financially. And that's what he did. But the problem is when he reached Nicaragua and he started applying for jobs, he would get rejected. Because in Nicaragua, no one's ever seen anyone from Stanford, right? They've never seen that name on resumes. And he didn't also have a bachelor's degree. So they would prefer candidates from local colleges with bachelor's degrees, and they would pull in those candidates for opportunities. And so out of desperation, Raul started applying to jobs in a contact center. And he got a job in a contact center answering queries revolving around broken computers, right? A Stanford systems engineer sitting in call center in Nicaragua day in and day out, answering queries that are, basically like, hey, have you considered turning off and turning on your laptop type queries. And so what's wild is you'd think that a person that's so overqualified for the position would outperform. But the truth was actually quite distinct. He was underperforming, and largely because of his accent, right? It wasn't because of a lack of knowledge. It wasn't because of him not knowing what to say. It's because of how he communicated. And the end outcome ultimately led to him being forced to change the way he speaks, to change his accent permanently to be able to hold his job. Raul quit the job after 3 to 4 months, but that really got us thinking and building out the first algorithm out of a suite of speech understanding algorithms. Today, we're in 25 different cities in India and 23 cities in Philippines. We're scaling rapidly and bringing a lot of value Like some of the enterprises we deliver our algorithms to see a 20 to 30% improvement in core KPIs. So it's really fascinating, the improvements we provide.
Amazing. Amazing. Brianne, is there anything you've really highlighted in your, teaching, particularly with many of your students at Georgetown, about solutions really to help mitigate bias, technical, non-technical, doesn't matter. Just things that, top of mind, come to the conversation as you're going through your work with students?
Yeah, I think so right now I'm actually the first time teaching a course called Race, Racism, and Digital Technologies. So a part of it is to introduce students to the kind of lay of the land in terms of a lot of the professors and researchers that have been doing work in this space. Comes to mind if you all are interested. Very big book, Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble, and then also Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin, right? And so with these kind of two books combined, I try to introduce students to the problem and to think about the fact that tech is not neutral, right? And really in society, to kind of make it bigger to African-American studies, that the world that we have created is not neutral in that regard, and to keep that in mind, right? So then we move forward outside of the kind of like, this is the land of the land. There's race bias in the aspects that we are encountering, and more into solutions. So in both of those books, right, they have talked about codes and algorithms, and the ways in which I think really that Krishna and Max have already outlined for us, right, that it starts from the beginning, right? So, but for me and how I talk to my students, because they are the ones using, right, and thinking about tech in certain ways and being already integrated into it because of their generation. For me, it also starts out with the usage, right? So for people who may use the technology that we have created, how is the technology actually helping them? How is it hurting them? And sometimes that comes with that the technology itself is causing harm after it's been designed. But with considering that, kind of moving backwards, as they have already said, and engaging with the certain types of questions. So the big thing for me is always, what types of questions are we asking of the technology? What do we want it to solve? Especially because it's not, for me, just about the technology, but about the usage and its meaning in everyday life, because I'm a humanities professor at the core of it. And so what types of questions, and that's a scientific kind of, approach, I would say, for the STEM majors out there, right? Your hypothesis is based upon the questions and how you design it. So what are the questions and how are you asking the questions? What do you want to solve, and who is included in those questions or not? Always, for me, is starting it. And I'll think about this a little bit more to give you a couple of examples about what I mean about how do you frame the question?
Yeah.
Because framing the question gives you different outcomes. And that's what I encourage my students when they're doing their research projects at the end of the semester. What do you want to answer? How are you framing the question? But I'll think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, we'll frame it, how to sort of get to the right questions as well as we continue in this dialogue. One of the areas that I want to spend a little bit more time in is the data question itself. And so the setup on this is pretty fascinating right now, right? Because in 2017, we saw the introduction of the Attention is All You Need paper, and it largely started to introduce a new wave around AI that was mostly around, this notion of a transformer architecture, and of course, the emergence of large language models in the last few years. The evolution of the large language models and the generative pre-trained transformers, the GPTs that we know well of right now, are heavily predicated on data, right? Because as we're finding out, the more data that we continue to throw into a transformer, the more capable in terms of human-like reasoning the transformer continues to perform. And so getting to that question of data in the setup of like, okay, we're going into a data-driven world versus even a model-driven world when it comes to AI. And Andrew Ng, other folks have certainly sort of talked about that over the last few years. Data gets encoded into, or say bias gets encoded into the data itself, particularly as some of these AI systems are built. And so as time continues to march on, we're seeing large masses of data that are required, right? And the training of the GPT-4 style model, perhaps even as much as 20% of the available human knowledge on the public web to be able to build this next generation of model. And so how do we think about the bias that's being introduced up front in all of this corpus of information? And is there a way to balance that in any way in terms of understanding what goes into training the model, what goes into balancing the model appropriately as these models are being built? Krishna, I know you spent a fair amount of time on this even before Fidler. Of course, and dealing with some of these issues when you were at Meta, but maybe you can start off this portion of the conversation.
Yeah, this is a very, very hard problem, right? Like I think with classical ML, at least you had access to the training data that was being supplied to the model and how it was trained upon. But these generative AI models are often trained on vast quantities of data, on internet scale data, and it presents a formidable challenge to understand, what's the training data that was used to, and what does it did it have potential biases, and biases can come from various different perspectives, cultures, ideologies. We heard about accent bias from Max. So, and more so, these models are actually owned by private entities, right? The most popular ones are not publicly available for scrutiny. And so this lack of transparency also further exacerbates. This is actually a pretty hard problem. And so like if you have these giant LLM that has been processed built on like internet scale data, and it's actually producing things, and it's probably exhibiting also emergent behaviors, as you just mentioned.
Yep.
Now, how is the emergent behavior actually potentially reinforcing biases or bringing new things into picture? These are all things that are very, very hard to solve for. And so I think it's not simply saying that, okay, let's increase the coverage of data and let's try to like build stuff, right? Even if I'm doing prompt engineering or fine tuning on top of these LLMs, and even if I do all of the things, if I have carefully sampled my data and curated it, make sure that it balances out in terms of distribution across all the stereotypes and genders, races, whatever I care about, what is the guarantee that the underlying LLM is actually not built, with equitable sources of data, right? So this is actually a very hard problem in front of us. And so essentially, this is where, we need tools to look into the models more deeply, inspect biases, report out these issues. Testing of models becomes very important aspect, because you're being given a black box like a GPT model or a Anthropic or whatever, in any of these, like or a text image models. And so how do you test these models, and how do you know how do you constantly monitor them? Is going to be a big issue for us. I think yeah. So the boat has sailed a little too far for us, and so we have to like catch up in terms of setting up these guardrails right now. So
Max or Brian, anything you want to add to Krishna?
It's really interesting. If I think there's a massive amount of bias that just simply comes from data sampling, right? And data sampling can vary from algorithm to algorithm, and I think putting a lot of emphasis on data sampling strategies for machine learning is going to be critical, and components of this observability is going to be such an important factor for our growth. But at Sonic, what we do is largely around speech machine learning, right? And large language models revolve around text. In text-based machine learning, you might gather data through web scraping, or buying licensed data sets that are off of the internet. But if you think about it, the internet is inherently very biased, right? It mostly consists of English language and it's largely predominated by younger individuals, probably higher income, right, if they have access to computers and Wi-Fi. Internet also is sampled more heavily, biased more heavily towards men, right? There are more men on the internet statistic, and so on. And the problem here is that also that text is a very flat domain, right? Unlike voice, where if you listen to a voice, right, you can very easily identify the gender and the age of an individual. And text, you really don't have that luxury. Can't really identify someone's background as easily leveraging text. So there's a core question that arises: how does someone source data effectively to reduce bias in these large language models? And there's a ceiling for what's actually physically possible. There's another big component that comes here, right? So with the appearance of these generative models, creating and spreading content online is incredibly easy. Just a few lines of code can bring you, basically the opening chapter of the dream book, or write a whole blog that you've always wanted to write, when previously it took weeks or months for you to do that. And the problem here is that the newly created content is basically mirroring the biases that might already exist within the original algorithm's output. And the problem here is also that there's no reliable method to distinguish between human-created and algorithm-created text. It's even hard in voice-based machine learning, right? If you think voice is such, some complicated with signals, right? You can barely do it for voice. And this is going to be a growing problem. On top of that, even if you're trying to sample data, right, from other languages that might exist, right, online, or other, viewpoints, oftentimes that's content that's translated from other languages. So you're also leveraging biases from these, translation algorithms that might exist. So it's a really complicated issue. And part of me also wonders, have we reached like this point of no return where there's so much generated content online that it's really hard to identify what's human, what isn't human? And the original algorithms that already have a lot of this bias, is it possible to differentiate that between their algorithms, their outputs, and actual real human outputs? I think that'll be a pretty growing factor for humanity. But yeah.
So
anyone who has access to the old web data is sitting on a big moat. They should like block it out, and that's uncorrupted by all the AI generated data, and that's probably a big moat if you have got like a corpus of web data that's not AI generated.
yeah,
Yeah.
put that in a secure facility that no one can taint anymore.
Correct.
So sorry, Brand, you're gonna say something there?
Yeah. I think, okay, let me try to put on my professor hat a little bit.
Please do.
Because I think this is where I'm most comfortable. Like, I'm trying to come to this as like an expert, but like at the core of it, I really love my job because I can also teach. So I think one of the things is to consistently, going back to the types of question, is to consistently question the truths that we think that we know. And I have a couple examples of this. So one here at Georgetown, there's two kind of like big initiatives. One is very much backed by the government, really much trying to think big scale, right, types of understandings around tech. And so it's called Tech and Society. The other, to your question, George, and the points that Krishna and Max, you brought up, is the Massive Data Institute. That's literally its name, right? And so thinking about these two initiatives, what's interesting to me again is the types of data and what is data. So it's almost, for me in teaching my students, this kind of almost self-fulfilling prophecy, right? To where if for me in African-American studies, and I teach specifically on Blackness, if Black people have been left out of the conversation for so long, that then when it comes to the questions that you all are asking, it is for me very apparent, I would say, when a student of mine turns in something from ChatGPT that is using Black history, because that's been left out of the canon and the kind of understanding about what data is important to train these models on in the first place, right? So if I ask students, hey, take this theorist and write an analysis examining XYZ question that I may have. And if they have decided to use ChatGPT, it's inherently wrong because the data that ChatGPT or any of these kind of AI models have used have left African Americans, Black people out of the understanding about what is important data to begin with, right? So I think that there's a real also question about what are we assuming that these models can do? Because just by the virtue of understanding bias and exclusion, right, there's ways in which these things have not actually also considered Black people, right? So there's an article actually that we went over last week and this week, there was a tech CEO that was talking about HCI, for instance, and thinking through Google Assistant, Alexa, and Siri, right? And the kind of accents, to your point, Max, that they were being trained on in terms of the value market, right? So it was an Australian English accent, right? A Indian English accent, and what was and then like an American and British English accent, right? And so there, the question was, what about African-American vernacular English, right? But the CEO says we are kind of talking to a valued market. And that value market then what excludes Black Americans from that, right? And so with that, then the last example that I have, I also studied the ways in which Black people in my Black digital feminisms class, especially Black women, can tell, right, the ways in which people have been left out of the conversation. So during the kind of first iteration around this understanding of election cycles and all of that in 2016, there was this hashtag started called Your Slip is Showing. And Your Slip is Showing is a adage in the African-American community saying that basically we can see your undergarments, right? A slip being the undergarments. And the slip is showing was talking about the types of accounts that were created to bolster information about the elections that was misinformation to the African-American community. And was because these AIs, yes, they may have made, or not AIs, but these accounts. So these are people created accounts, but I'm getting to the point. They're people created accounts, but the language used, right, was not correct Ave, because it is a grammar-based system. And yes, this was a Black woman on this account, but it was, you could tell from the language patterns that it wasn't quite accurate to the Black experience. And these Black women were able to see that and started a hashtag around this aspect. And so I think, with talking to my students, is who's left out of the conversation also doesn't make it legible to the types of data that we think that we know. So it's always, for me, questioning the question, continuing to be critical, who's left out of the conversation. And that's really what's exciting and what I want to kind of present to my students and continue to have them challenge themselves, and also to you all on this call today.
Great response. Appreciate that, Brianne. When we think about this question, and by the way, I'm going to do a little bit of lightning round stuff because the audience has actually brought up some interesting points as we've been discussing. So I'm going to introduce those into the conversation, if that's okay. So one of the things that one of the audience members had called out was, what's more effective in cleaning or just debiasing the models? Is it in cleaning the training data itself? Is it in selectively training? Is it in improving or cleansing or debiasing? It's, I think when he says cleansing, it means debiasing, but debiasing the output. What is the best place that we should be considering the idea that we can help debias, particularly some of these AI systems that have been built? Is it in the data itself? Is it in the selective training or the output as well?
Yeah,
I don't know.
so I guess I think there is a whole notion of fairness aware machine learning. I think there's like a practice around how you can all the way from like curating of your training data, making sure the data distributions are balanced, right? They're not overtly biased against any sections of populations that you care about. And then, training the model and validating the model on what signals are actually, driving the model's performance. This is where explainability becomes important. What factors are driving the model predictions. And then when you deploy the model, monitoring the model overall, but also monitoring the segments that you care about, how the model is performing on these segments, the gender-based segments, racial segments, or in other intersectionalities that you care about in terms of fairness, right? This is like a pretty decent like approach in terms of fairness of ML. I think the fork into this problem comes into when you actually are trying to do this with LLMs, right? Now, all of a sudden, you're not doing classical ML training. You actually are doing some sort of prompt engineering or fine tuning on top of an LLM. And the LLM itself is like a third party LLM that you're getting. And that's where, you need to spend a lot more effort into testing your prompt engineered LLM and trying to figure out all possible failure scenarios, how it would respond to certain questions, whether it has any inadvertent bias already baked into it, which I'm sure it does. And so how do you then make sure that at least your sort of application that you're building on top of it is not exhibiting those things and you're setting up guardrails, right? So yeah, so I think I would say like those 3 stages of careful, data curation, and if there, and any, so this is where also synthetic data could help. Model validation with explainability and model monitoring and on segment monitoring is at least from a basic point of view that you can get going to build this fairness aware ML practice in your organization.
So maybe on that front, I know there's a number of things that we should probably zoom back out on as we've kind of dug into the details in terms of how we think through data and particularly the models as they're continuing to evolve. Organizationally, as we think about most of the way that we comport ourselves as organizations that are entering into this AI first world, things that this team here, this group of experts wants to comment on how we build organizations. What are some practical things that we can deliver advice to everyone who's listening on this call on approaching this really challenging topic? And first and foremost, just the people and processes that we need to think up front as we build organizations that are meant for this AI first world.
I can start off with an interesting process that I think would be really helpful building algorithms that reduce bias. I think at its core, the biggest emphasis point should be around analytics with respect to this, because machine learning researchers, they build algorithms, right? MLOps train these algorithms, but then how do you evaluate the inherent biases around these algorithms, right? You need an analytics team, whether it's linguists, whether it's data labelers, and however you want to structure it. But it's critical to have this department. And as part of having this department, I'd suggest organizations create some sort of a scorecard, sort of a model scorecard that evaluates the dimensions associated with bias that might appear within your model. Each time you retrain a model, or you might modify the data sampling strategy you might have based on certain biases, you reevaluate this entire model output, and you see what changes actually happen from readjusting the data that gets fed into the model. Similarly, you could have a similar model scorecard that's deployed on customer sites that also evaluates the outputs. Right? Krishna talked about observability on customer sites as well. So that's another important thing. I think it's a big process.
So I think, I think all of this is possible if there is like C-suite buy-in, right? Like, a lot of like the whole ethical AI stuff is essentially, it's kind of a unfortunately, I don't want to use the term like a lipstick on a pig type of a thing, right? It's essentially most people talk about it, but very little. Some organizations are doing it. So some of our customers have set up AI councils, AI governance teams, the kind of teams that Max talks about, that are supposed to review these models, evaluate them. They have red teams where, that go on trying to like label the model outputs and see which is harmful, which is not harmful, right? But I think a lot of it also has to come from like the top level, that they want to do the right thing. And this is where I think also regulations can help, in terms of accelerating some of the laggards, to pay attention to these things. Because today, like as I said, the closed source models, we don't know how they're built and how do we inspect them? How do we scrutinize them? That's actually a big problem, right? So marrying the ethical AI to business incentives is another thing. And so like we try to, when we do the advocacy, we also try to advocate that doing like, ethical AI is good for business, versus not like, just not like, not doing it for some, societal sake, right? Like, so I think it needs to start from the top. Fortunately, what is happening with the LLMs, it's just opened the Pandora's box, right? There's so many risks with LLMs. There's hallucinations, there's toxicity, there's data privacy risk. So there's organizations are now responding to that hey, I think you really need to set up guardrails. And this is a huge opportunity for us to sneak in kind of these bias detection and the things also that care about bias in these type of guardrail type of systems. So organizations can then start leveraging these tools to detect not only the hallucination parts of LLM, but also like biases and sort of address those things right from the beginning. Still, so it's a good opportunity. So there's a window that was opened up that we could take advantage of.
Yeah. And for me, just real quick, I think to reiterate, we'll say, what Krishna has already said is that the more you increase the ways in which your product can help, again, if technology is to get us from A to B or to solve problems, the more types of problems your tool can solve, the better it is for your bottom line. And I'll say this in one way. So in terms of the pedagogy and also my own kind of philosophy is to think through who is of the least of us. If they were free, right, then all of us would be free. And an example of this is that I love watching Netflix with subtitles, right? Right. I don't necessarily have like the kind of deep auditory ability issues, or not issues, but aspects to how I embody and go through life that people who have severe hearing loss or are hard of hearing, but it helps me on a kind of other neurodiverse level to where I can understand what's going on better, right? And so while that was not designed for me in mind, it still helps me. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, again, to reiterate, it has to be important to you as a value, but the value also being that you're expanding who you can reach with it and helping your bottom line. The third thing, as a professor of thinking about technology in a Black Studies department, is that what I'm talking about is not necessarily new, but what I'm talking about, it is new to thinking about the digital and technology, right? And so for me, I always am bringing in social context, right? So it's not just enough to say that these models have the issues that we've outlined today, but what is the social context by which they were created? What is the social context that they will go out into the world? And so always critically thinking about the kind of humanities, again, to bring that back, and meaning-making aspects of where we are in the world right now, where we have gone, and what we kind of want our future to look like. And then again, lastly, for me, is always the critical culture. So I can, sit here and, this is for all of us in any context, and be a face in the room. But if I am not in the kind of culture that says my voice is important and that I can be critical about what is going on, my kind of concerns will fall flat. And so is that a part of the kind of DEI that Insight Partners is hosting us to kind of think through? And I just also want to say thank you to George and Danya and Chuma also for asking me to talk with you all today, and Max and Krishna for being great panelists this morning.
So in closing, I know we're almost out of time here. I did want to sort of insert one last question. Tech and the tech industry itself has such a tremendous impact on where this is all headed. And I'm going to just ask the hard question last, which is like, what can the industry itself do, right, to be able to be a force of good, be a force of positive social change, particularly with some of the challenges that we have ahead of us, and also, frankly, introduced with the emergence of some of the AI systems that are now coming to the mainstream.
Yeah, you want to go? Yeah, I'm an optimist. Despite like kind of like, and we've been working on it for 5.5 years. Maybe there's some sort of pessimism that came in the way I spoke about these things, but I'm still an optimist. I think there are several things that are happening in the right direction, right? The rise of open source is actually a good thing in LLMs. So now it's going to democratize the model building, right? Like, so I think eventually we'll see in the next few years, we'll have a lot more options for us to choose from, not just like the closed source models. And then there's also the NIST, the governments are waking up to it. There's guidelines and governance guidelines. There's, AI safety is top of mind. I think for a lot of like customers that we engage with, like the CIOs who are being asked to set up AI infra, they are actually, looking into these issues is much more seriously than ever before, because it's, as I said, that there's the marriage between ethical AI and good business is already happening, because it's people realize that they really can't ship these generative AI apps without taking these issues into consideration. So that's actually a good thing. So it's enforce, and so that's a good trend that I see. And then from a technical side of things, there's like more and more sophistication, like tools like Fiddler, and we've been innovating over the years to develop new techniques to detect these things. And so trying to like, get ahead of these situations, right? So I think these are all the three positive trends that I see, and I'm hopeful that maybe next year when we do this panel again, we would have some interesting cases to talk about.
We sure will. Max or Brian, anything in closing?
I'd say I just want to echo Christian's words on open source. I think it'll be very, very critical. I think figuring out also effective methodologies for monetizing data across different different lines of business and conversation types, and
and I think finally for me, bravo again, and kudos to all of you on this call today. So it shows me that there is interest and investment in trying to solve these issues. And I think at least having that as knowledge, leaving this call was really heartening for me, kind of being in my academic circle. And then also to all of you who will be watching this after it airs. So just having the kind of investment and wanting to stay on this call on your very busy Wednesday morning, just go from there. Just having the investment and continuing to have the questions is great. It's a great start.
Appreciate this intimate and important conversation. It's something we certainly will have to have in the coming years. So it's great for the team here to come on and have this discussion. I think in closing, one thing I did want to sort of mention in the end of Black History Month here is how interconnected we all are. And one of the things that I don't know if everyone noticed here is the number of immigrants that are on this call, right? And the number of immigrants being on this call wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the the 1965 act, the Immigration Act that occurred, which wouldn't have been possible unless there was the Civil Rights Act that was certainly led by the great Martin Luther King and others, which wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for, the, civil rights movement itself and the, sort of ability for us to have nonviolent ability to protest in civil disobedience, which wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't a lawyer in South Africa about 70 years before named Mohandas Gandhi, who was kicked off a train because he wanted to be, sort of in first class, and he got kicked to third class, and that set off a movement that, sort of really pushed the civil rights and many of the things that we saw subsequent to it. So I did want to mention all that because of the interconnectedness of who we are as human beings, and the importance that this arc is a long one, and ideally humanity does get this all right over time. So thanks for that time and opportunity to have this conversation, and looking forward to quite a few more in the years to come.
Thank you so much, George, for moderating. Thank you for our panelists for your time this morning. Thank you for everyone here who tuned in. And I hope you have a great rest of your mornings.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
guys.
Danya.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, George.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.